Thanks, Jonathan, and very glad to be speaking here today, despite the slight half-emptying of the room just before we sat down. So this presentation will be about 15 slides or so, and we'll cover probably a lot of topics that Heather will cover as well, but broadly want to take a look at 4 things today. So the first is current polling in terms of salience of immigration, which underneath that is a whole host of other subtopics. Second will be immigration in the wider values space. I think so we're kind of taking a little bit of a step back from the minutiae of policy and onto just generally where does immigration sit within a wider framework and political framework. The third thing is the demographics of pro and anti-immigration sentiment. I think it's worth revisiting that and who supports it, who doesn't, how does that differ by subtopic. And then the fourth, I think, is probably the most interesting, is the geography of pro and anti-immigration sentiment, which I think will produce some familiar themes for those of you who've been talking about Brexit. So moving on, this to me is one of the most interesting charts in British politics, which is about the salience of immigration as a top 3 issue. So YouGov have been tracking that on a weekly basis since 2011. And I think what's really interesting is that obviously you can select 3 topics, and it's interesting that between 45 and around 60% of people consistently between 2011 and 2016 chose immigration as a top concern. As a top number 1 concern, that did spike leading up to the referendum, but as a more top 3 rounded kind of concern set, it was fairly high for 5 years or so before the referendum vote. Pretty much straight after the referendum vote, we saw a fairly extraordinary deflation of immigration as a salient political topic, and that continued all the way to 2020. Basically moving from around the 3rd most important issue to around the 15th most important issue amongst the UK public, which again was a response to the vote and the belief from some people that a vote to leave would in some ways ameliorate concerns that they had about levels of migration. What's interesting is that since then, it has begun to rise in salience, but nowhere near to the levels that it once was. Now, bear with me, this is quite a dry slide. I'll give you a warning for each dry slide we have. What we did here is ask people about 4 very different things, 4 very different perspectives in terms of the topic of immigration, and asked them how they felt about it. So the first question was whether, it's quite a bleak question, but whether people had any sympathy for migrants who are crossing the English Channel by boat. And what was pretty astonishing is that there was broadly, I think around 52% of people had sympathy. I think around 45% of people didn't. But what was really interesting is the degree of age differential on that. So we saw almost every group over 55 in every part of the country, and probably in almost every constituency in the UK, would not have any sympathy, and the reverse was true for younger people. But here's what's interesting. As you move to more esoteric or slightly difficult and less emotive topics, that wide differentiation begins to shrink. So, for example, if you ask the question, has our levels of immigration over the last decade undermined or enriched British society, that produces the scary numbers of 52-48 or 53-47, but actually the other way, towards enriching British society versus undermining it. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the political geography of those numbers later on. When we get to numbers, and I know I'm almost certain that Heather will cover numbers as well in her presentation, public opinion is further to the right. Almost all groups believe there should be a net reduction, there should be a reduction in numbers in terms of immigration, and the polling has been very consistent across the last 5 to 10 years on that. But when the framing is economic, and the question is, do we need immigrants to help with our economic recovery, filling certain job vacancies, you can see, again, the pendulum swings much further towards the progressive end of the spectrum. So I think, the main summary here is, do we really live in a world which is split 50-50? The answer is no. The British public is remarkably flexible by subtopic. The people who might take a particular liberal view when it comes to economics may take a very authoritarian or less liberal view when it comes to culture. It's very, very hard to pinpoint people, except for probably 25% of people on either end of the spectrum who will basically straight ticket their answers, kind of independent of the context. This is a summary, really, of that. And you can see here the very kind of wild oscillation in terms of depending on the exact framing. You can see there in a rather dry note the exact questions that we used, which I'm sure we can cover later. Just moving on into the drivers of anti-immigration sentiment. You know, who are the people that are structurally, I talked a little bit about this kind of 20% on each side. Who are the people who are always, irrespective of circumstances, anti-immigration sentiment? And the markers are fairly political, so people who are currently going to vote for the Reform Party, that should be no surprise. People who voted Leave in 2016, people that defected away from another party to the Conservatives in 2019, people without a university education. What we don't have here is density markers, but generally people who live on kind of ex-suburban areas and rural areas. And again, age crops up, although it's not as salient as political markers. The opposite is also true for people who are drivers of pro-migration sentiment. So again, you'll see that the same kind of things pop up. People who are more likely to be Green supporters, people who are students, people who vote for the SNP or the Liberals or the Green Party, people who may have voted Remain. And here, do you have a university degree? I mean, if Rob was here, a lot of what he would talk about is the effects of education. His big thesis is that the expansion of higher education has led to this kind of self-sorting. And again, that definitely crops up from the numbers that are there. I'll spend a little bit of time on this. So this is a matrix which kind of outlines on the horizontal axis the Conservative lead amongst the British public on a particular issue versus the Labour Party. So again, we've had to isolate all the other parties. On the vertical axis is issue importance. I'll return to issue importance because it's very important to note. I can see that this is of interest because all the cameras are up. Issue importance can either be self-expressed or it can be inferred. If it's self-expressed, that's a respondent saying, I think this issue is important. If it's inferred, that's someone working out statistically whether that particular issue is very relevant to their vote choice. In this instance, it's an explicit measure of importance. A couple of things notable here. First of all, the Labour lead versus Conservative. On almost every issue, polling currently stands. That shouldn't be a surprise. They lead the Conservatives by 20 to 25 points in the polls. But, really, really structurally, the more salient the issue, the bigger the lead, which I think underpins why their poll lead is quite large at the minute. But look at the exception, stopping any more immigration. You can see there, and again, this was done in November, but you can see here the political logic behind taking a stronger stance, particularly on the issue of small boats. And in case we wanted to look into the numbers, is immigration too high or not? This was a 10,000 person poll that we conducted where we asked people to agree with that sentiment. Was it too high or not? And it's worth, again, remembering that every group by age believes that it is too high on a net basis. But you can see here a massive age differential. Look at the difference between 18 to 24-year-olds and 65 plus is there. And again, you'll see an interesting slight gender effect as well between males and females, a persistent theme in politics in the UK. We'll see how long that lasts for. So just speeding through, again, this analysis by kind of A, B, C1, C2, D, E, what we call kind of segments. There's not much difference, but as soon as you get into education, look at the massive differences. So again, this is a country that continues to be divided by education, and that's a theme I'll pick up later. So, geographic variation is my favourite topic. If you ask the question, has immigration over the last 10, 15, 20 years, it doesn't really matter, has it enriched us or has it undermined British society? Polls will kind of ping around 52-48 for either proposition. And that's extremely interesting. But the more interesting fact is that on a geographic basis, that's very unevenly distributed. So, for example, in this particular study, which I helped design, actually, I think barely a majority and a plurality believed that it had kind of undermined British society, but barely. But as soon as you looked at it on a constituency basis, 75% of constituencies in the UK believe that it had undermined, and that's because of the uneven distribution. That's because fundamentally, people who are very structurally progressive tend to be concentrated in terms of where they live in exactly the same areas. which again was very, very visible in the referendum, which was that all the most Remain areas were far more Remain than all the most Leave areas. So the top Remain areas in the country in the referendum, particularly when you looked at it by ward, there were many areas that were in excess of 90%, particularly around in London and Cambridge. But in terms of Leave, there were very few areas that were above 80% in terms of Leave. So it had a much more even distribution throughout the country. This, again, this kind of geographic distributional pattern is shared on, in terms of this sentiment, which I think, again, poses a number of interesting questions. Here's a really interesting thing that I think is worth just reflecting on. There's been a couple of statements and discussions about Brexit, and what I find really interesting is that attitudes towards immigration today have a stronger relationship to the propensity to vote Leave in 2016 than people's beliefs about voting Leave today. In other words, the Leave coalition that exists today is much less related to Leave in 2016 than the cultural and policy divides that exist on immigration today, which is quite interesting. So in other words, Leave is no longer Leave, but in some ways, some of these other issues have displaced that, which again is very, very interesting, which I display here in some very unuser-friendly maps, which all look the same. But you can see that the patterns and the shape of everything look quite similar. It's actually made most clear by these two graphs. So the graph on the left is effectively the relationship between the vertical axis is the Leave vote of 2016. The horizontal axis is the belief that immigration is too high by constituency. You can see it's a very tight fit there for those of you that care. That's an R squared of about 80%, I think, 85. But if you map the Leave vote from 2016 to the Leave vote today, the R squared actually collapses all the way to 65%. In other words, very, very different political proposition. Now that we kind of discussed the geography of this, and I think after this presentation, Ollie and the other team will be putting up a diagram of the Inglehart-Welzel map, which I'll cover what that means. But broadly, what we've done here is look into kind of attitudes by amongst the British public in terms of where would they feel comfortable in terms of increasing or reducing immigration. So you can see here quite wild flexes by country. Again, the same familiar candidates: Australia, New Zealand, the Republic of Ireland, people are much more comfortable. Canada, other countries, particularly, for example, Pakistan and elsewhere, people are much more sceptical. But underneath the numbers, it's not just a straight line how English are these types of countries. We see people more comfortable in having more migrants from Hong Kong than France. And there's a lot going on underneath the numbers. It's not a straight line translation of how English are these countries or how familiar are we or what's the level of kinship. There's a lot going on in terms of people's attitudes by country and how selective they are and the belief the levels of how easily integration can happen. And I think the British public, just to kind of summarise, is just a bit more complex, a bit more multifaceted, a bit harder to guess on the issue of immigration than I think is sometimes warranted from newspapers from all sides. I think I've rattled through that quite quickly because I've got two other speakers. But in summary, and not that in summary, immigration is much less salient than in 2016. And it is also decoupled from actual immigration levels. That kind of happened in 2016. If you look at kind of graphs before 2016, belief that immigration was too high or too low basically moved in lockstep with actual numbers. That broke in 2016. Second thing is control and reduction of net numbers is still quite important to the public. But attitudinally, the UK has moved more into a more progressive space on almost every single metric over the past 10 years, whether that's the level, whether migrants contribute to the cultural enrichment of the country, and it's worth remembering that. But again, also worth flagging, as the UK has got more liberal on economic and social issues, that is moved in the opposite direction of where our politics have moved. Again, to add another layer of complication. I think that's it for me.
Thanks very much. Heather.